welcome back. This is our second lesson on our journey to learn the tarot, and as you can see I've got a table full of decks. This lesson is about tarot history, and I decided that actually there's no better way to learn than to look at the decks themselves. So I'm going to give you a tour through what's part of my collection, and hopefully when we've finished you'll have an idea of how these wonderful cards developed into what we have today. So where do we start? We start with this one. This dates back to the mid-15th century, and it's a reproduction of the earliest known complete tarot deck that we have. Well, almost complete. There's a couple of cards missing which in a reproduction like this have been replaced with basically modern approximations. So this deck is known as the Visconti Sforza tarot. The reason we've given it that name is we know it was handcrafted for the noble Visconti family in Italy, and there are a series of these decks that the family commissions. So the decks, the surviving decks as we have them, are known as the Visconti decks. This is the earliest one, known as the Visconti Sforza. You can see with these, they're handcrafted. The backgrounds on the originals are actually gold leaf. That doesn't come over on this sort of printed reproduction quite so well. These would have been, well, they are priceless, you know, as it stands now. Handcrafted cards like this would have been a very expensive affair. What this tells us is the tarot originated as a game, we think in Italy, in the 1400s, maybe a little bit earlier. The earliest surviving full deck that we have is from the mid-1400s anyway. Let's see what's actually in here. There is a resemblance to a playing card deck. Let me just put those aside for a second. The biggest chunk of the tarot deck consists, like a playing card deck, of 4 suits, but these suits are different. Whereas we have spades, clubs, hearts and diamonds in our modern deck, what we have in the tarot is, first and foremost, in this early tarot, the suit of coins. We have the suit of swords. These are the aces, incidentally. We have the suit of wands, or staffs or rods as they would have been known. And finally we've got the suit of cups. So 4 suits, as with a playing card deck. These suits also contain court cards. Now this is where the tarot differs from a standard deck. In our standard playing card deck we will have 3 court cards of Jack, Queen and King. In a tarot deck you have 4. So you have the Page, the Knight, the Queen, and finally the King. So overall, this section of the deck consists of 56 cards. Now, what sets the tarot aside is the addition of these extra cards. Now, in the game of tarot, as it was developed, these were known as the trumps or the triumphs. Now, what we see in this first deck is very, very similar to what we have in a modern tarot deck. So you can see here the first card is the Fool. Now some people have said that this equates to the Joker in a modern deck. We're not quite so sure. Jokers were a late addition, but whatever the case, the Fool is basically the first card in this 22 card sequence. Interesting with this deck, here's a figure to note. the Popess. Her equivalent in our modern decks is the High Priestess. You'll notice as we go through here, and as we follow through these lessons, you'll notice that even though the images in these early decks are very, very similar to what we have today, some of these images have evolved, mutated slightly, had layers of symbolism added. So we'll come to, when we see some of the later decks, you'll understand what I mean. But this figure is very important. The Visconti family had a fabulously eccentric ancestor who set herself up as the leader of an alternative sect to the Catholic Church. So in effect, she installed herself as a female pope. And we think that actually the Popess in this deck is her portrait. So it ties it very strongly to the family that this deck was created for. Other things in this deck that tie it to the family, if you look closely on the aces, several of these aces actually have Visconti family mottos on them, on the little banners, as you can see. So this is it's a splendid deck. These are very, very beautiful. They would have been very, very expensive items to own. So we can guess from this that maybe the cards as a game were originally, it was a game for the nobility perhaps. We do have surviving early examples of printed cards, but nothing before these. The earliest cards that we have are these, you know, incredibly high quality handcrafted editions. So there we have it. The Visconti decks, a group of decks, the earliest that we know, virtually intact. I said there are a couple of cards missing from this deck. Those cards from our modern deck are the Devil and the Tower. You can see in this edition they've been repainted very close to the style of the originals. So you would hardly know unless you were an art historian. I'm not. So there we have it. Now, this is the earliest almost intact deck we have. What about the first commercially produced cards? Well, we do have a very early example. This probably comes from the 16th century, as far as I know. We assume that the game had spread from the nobility to the working classes with the invention of the printing press, and as print costs began to come down, tarot as a game was manufactured through woodcut block printing. Now this is the earliest example of printed tarot that we have. It's not a complete deck. It's actually a fragment of an uncut sheet of cards, uncoloured, just in black and white. So there you have it. This is known as the Carey sheet because of the museum that it's housed in. Now, what makes this very interesting, it's tantalising. We can see edges of some cards, we can deduce what they are. We'll never know because this is the only surviving fragment of this deck. How it survived, I'm not sure. It's now housed, it's called the Carey sheet. It's housed, I think, in the Carey Museum in the States. Interestingly, the pattern on these cards is very, very similar to what comes later in the Marseille pattern of decks, which in a way set the pattern and the tradition for several hundred years. So this is the earliest mass-produced tarot, or evidence of mass-produced tarot, that we have. There we are. So, moving a little bit forward, we can assume that the game spread in popularity and began to spread outside of Italy to Europe, to the rest of Europe. Marseille in France became the biggest centre for the manufacture and design of tarot decks. So to give you an idea, what we now know as the Tarot of Marseille, which is still the most popular type of deck to be used in France, incidentally, Again, were printed on wood-cut print presses. Now, these decks were hand stenciled, the colours were applied through hand stenciling. And here we have it. This is the Fool from a Marseille deck. Now, what is noticeable here from the Carey sheet and from the Visconti is that these trump cards are now numbered. Now, I have my own theory behind this. I don't know whether I'm right or not. Decks like this, the game of tarot, it's a trick-taking game, so these cards are, the trump cards actually follow a sequence, and the higher up that sequence you go, the greater value and power those cards are. So say, for instance, the Fool would be the first card. Let's take the Juggler or the Magician would probably be the first card in the sequence. If somebody played one of the higher cards over this, say if they played the Popess over it, she would count as a more powerful card, so therefore whoever played the Popess would win the hand. The Fool was a wild card that could trump any of the cards at any time. So bear in mind, if these were created for nobility, nobility would be educated. They would have a basic grounding and education in classical symbolism, and they would have obviously religious education as well. So the trumps on these are unnumbered, but then I'm assuming that the people playing this game would understand which were the more powerful figures. On these mass-produced decks, we see Roman numerals at the top. So bear in mind, these decks would be widely available for all classes for playing card games. There's the Empress there, number 3, and the Emperor. You can see they're quite crudely printed and then hand stenciled. They have a charm of their own. This is a deck from 1760. It's from the printhouse, the Conver printhouse. It's widely considered to be the finest example of the Marseille pattern. So this is what tarot would have meant in the 17th and 18th century. And by this stage, it is a widely played card game right across Europe. So this became the standard pattern, but up until then there were lots of different variations. The trump cards in the Marseille decks follow the pattern of the trumps in the Visconti and a lot of the other earlier decks. Here's an interesting quirk. This is a deck, again a hand-painted deck known as the Sola Busca tarot. Now, the sequence of trumps is very different. All of these, apart from the Fool, are mythical or heroical figures. So we've got here Pandolfo, how do you pronounce that? Postumio. Who else have we got? Cantulo, Sesto, presumably Cestus, Nero. 22 trumps, again, but all very different from what we're used to seeing. Now, what makes this deck interesting is that the pip cards, unlike a standard playing card deck, show these full illustrations. Now, this was a first. This was the very first deck that actually fully illustrated all of the cards. That has great significance. The second deck to do this would set the pattern for the modern era, and we'll come to that soon. So this in itself is a very important deck. Let's have a look at one of the other variations, one of the other Italian variations. Here's an interesting deck. I think this is an 18th century edition. This is known as a Minchiate deck, so this is a variant on the tarot. Much bigger deck, 97 cards and 41 trumps. There are a lot of unfamiliar images in here that we don't see in the tarot. There's a full set of astrological symbols, the 4 elements. There's this very odd figure. There's no Popess in this deck, but we do have a Grand Duke. didn't survive into the standard tarot pattern, but there you go. So that's a Minchiate deck. You can see the variations before the pattern of the deck settled more or less into what we know today with the Marseille. So that pattern carried through into the 18th century. Now, bear in mind, the cards are still being used just to play a game. What happened when the fortune tellers got hold of them? Now, the earliest example of this that we know was from a French guy called Etteila, and he's the first known professional tarot reader, tarot author, and fortune-telling deck creator. Now, this is a later edition of his deck. Now, this is different again. He must have used a Marseille deck as his starting point, but he's completely changed the sequence of the trumps. So we've got some images in here that we would be unfamiliar with, and others that we can part recognise as trumps from the Marseille, but have been subtly altered. So you can see this one bears a great resemblance to the moon with the towers and the dogs. This one here, Revelation, you can see that is in effect, that's basically the star card. But he altered the sequence of the cards to suit his own purposes. He attributed fortune-telling meanings to them. And for the first time, if you look at the pip cards, he began to associate astrology and other esoteric meanings to these, and each of them is assigned a fortune-telling meaning. You can see on this edition those keywords are printed on the cards. Let's have a look and find another example. The Two of Cups is a good one. There we are. So you can see that there's, interestingly, the Two of Cups, some of these meanings have survived into modern tarot interpretation, I should say. So look at this, the Two of Cups, you can see some occult symbolism beginning to creep in there. And he denoted the Two of Cups as the card of love, which it still is today. So Etteila, the first official fortune teller, the first person to, as we know, to take tarot and turning it into a specific divination tool. Now, he was also important because he was the first to refer to the trumps as the major arcana or the greater mysteries. That's the title we know them as, we know them as today. Likewise, he took the four suits, the pip cards and the courts, and referred to them as the minor arcana, the lesser mysteries. And those are terms that stay with us today, and you'll hear a lot through this course. So that's Etteila, the French fortune teller from the 18th century. So we move on through the 18th century into the 19th century, and he set a pattern. Fortune tellers, occultists became increasingly interested in the tarot. And I'm gonna jump forward a little bit to the late 19th century, early 20th century. Assume now that the sort of people with esoteric interests, the tarot was kind of was getting an increasing centre stage with them. We're going to jump forward to a group called the Order of the Golden Dawn, late 19th, early 20th century, London. And the tarot became very central to their rituals, their magic practices, and to their philosophies. They devised their own deck and their own symbolism, again based on the Marseille deck, but with, like Etteila, with astrological, planetary correspondences, divinatory meanings. And sadly, there are no Golden Dawn decks have survived in deck form, but there are all of the writings that detail the the symbolism of the cards, and a lot of very clear sketches remain. So it's very easy to reconstruct this deck, which a lot of modern artists have done. This is a modern reconstruction called the Golden Dawn Magical Tarot. It's published by Llewellyn, and it was created by Sandra and Chick Cicero. And you can see all of the major arcana are the same as the Marseille, but we're really beginning to see differences now. For the Fool is numbered 0 rather than being a wild card. It actually is at the beginning of the sequence. Le Battleur, or the Juggler, has become the Magician. So rather than this being a peddling magician now, it's very much a magician in the ritual magic tradition. Now, the Popess. She has become, in a wider sense, the High Priestess. So we're out of the realm of the Catholic Church or heresy, and we're into the wider realm of feminine spirituality. So you can see the kind of changes that were made in this deck. Similarly, the Pope has been retitled the Hierophant. So rather than having Catholic connotations, this figure becomes the male religious leader of an Eastern mystery sect. So, and other little things as well. I mean, the Lovers card in the Marseille deck, as you'll see, shows lovers hovered over by Cupid. We see the kind of high romantic take on Greek mythology here. Perseus rescuing Andromeda from the Kraken. Now, another interesting thing about this, the Golden Dawn slightly altered the sequence of the trumps. So whereas Strength was originally number 11, it becomes number 8, and Justice becomes number 11. This is a deck for divination, for meditation, and for magic ritual. So at this stage now, even though the tarot is still available as a game and can be played as a game, the game is going into eclipse, and the use of the cards as a divination tool and a tool for ritual magic have come to the forefront. Interestingly, in France, that still very much centres around the Marseille tradition. The Marseille tradition is still alive and kicking, and there are interesting, as print processes evolve, there are, have a look at these. This is a 19th century Italian deck, and you can see now these are much more refined than the woodblock prints. These are printed through lithography, very, very beautifully illustrated. As you can see, variations in the symbolism. In Italy, there was always more freedom, I think, with the symbolism than in France. So this is a very, very lovely deck. So yeah, there is the potential for gaming still, but that usage of the tarot as an occult tool has begun to grow very significantly. Now, one other deck, just to jump back a little bit. Here's an interesting deck. This is a deck called we now know as the Swiss 1JJ Tarot. The copy I have here is a 1970s copy, but this is a very important deck. This was actually a 19th century Swiss deck. It's important for two reasons. This is a variant of the Marseille, and it follows what's known as the Besançon pattern. Certain very conservative areas of Europe found the inclusion of the Pope and the Popess quite offensive. So in this deck, they're actually replaced with Greco-Roman deities. So you see card number 2, which should be the Popess, is actually the goddess Juno. And card number 5 is Jupiter. So we'll come back to this deck shortly, because this is a very, very important deck in modern tarot history, as well as 19th century tarot history. So we've covered the Golden Dawn, and that brings us roughly to 1909. And we're going to meet two figures, a figure called Arthur Edward Waite and a mystical artist called Pamela Colman-Smith. Waite was a member of the Golden Dawn, as was Pamela Colman-Smith. he broke away, set up his own order, and he wanted to create his own tarot deck. He commissioned Pamela Colman-Smith as his artist, and this is what resulted. The tarot cards published by Ryder and Sons in 1909, second edition 1910. What we know variously today as the Ryder Tarot, the Rider-Waite Tarot, the Smith-Waite Tarot. This is the blueprint for all modern decks. This is the deck that I'm using throughout our course for very good reason. Everything that has followed has been influenced by this. It was a great success, more than Waite or Smith could have ever realised. I think they envisaged that it would, be printed in a small print run. Would stick around for a little while. Actually, it stuck around for a long while. It went through 5 editions in its first incarnation. It stayed continuously in print until the London Blitz, when sadly the lithographic printing plates were destroyed in the bombing. Such was the appeal of this deck, it didn't take long before it began to resurface. It was pirated in the States by the De Laurence Company post-war, and it was then, its first modern colour editions were printed in the 1960s and early 70s. It stayed continuously in print. It sold over 1 million copies or more. I mean, I don't know what the sales figures are for this. If you've encountered tarot, it's likely that these are some of the images that you would have seen, on your first encounters. This is the blueprint. It's the mother of all modern tarot decks. Now, there is a very good reason for that. Let's cast our mind back to the Sola Busca tarot. That very, very early hand-painted deck that had the quirky idea of illustrating all the pip cards. Now, the difference with this is this was a game, so those illustrations were merely a quirk. Whereas here, Pamela Colman-Smith decided that she would illustrate all of the pip cards in a way that visually expressed the meaning of the card. So what we have here is a deck that's based on the Golden Dawn tarot meanings, but each picture tells the story and tells you what that meaning is. So this deck, one of the reasons this deck became so popular is because for the first time you didn't have to rely on formulas or memorising the meanings of the cards. The pictures told the story for you. So when you laid your cards out, you have a pictorial narrative of your reading. It's beautifully illustrated. It's one of my former work colleagues who was an eminent artist with a reputation worldwide, one of the foremost decorative artists in Europe. He'd originally trained as an illustrator. Now, even now when he sees this, he still considers it to be one of the finest examples of arts and craft illustration that he'd ever seen. I think that says it all, really, doesn't it? Everything that followed was more or less being influenced by this. Well, the bulk of what's followed. When we get to all these modern decks here, you'll see. Before we do, I'm just going to talk about one other very, very important deck. Another member of the Golden Dawn, who broke away and formed his own order, was the infamous Aleister Crowley. And probably the second most influential deck of the 20th century is his deck, the Crowley, what we know now as the Crowley Thoth Tarot. These are very different from Waite and Smith's deck. They are a lot more overtly esoteric. The illustrations are just stunning. They were created by Lady Freida Harris. She was not just a consummate artist, she was also a student of projective geometry. So you can see all of these astonishing geometrical patterns that the cards are based around. If you're serious about tarot, I mean, obviously I always say to people, start with the Waite-Smith deck, but you'll also probably want to acquire a copy of this deck. You may not work with it initially, but from an artistic point of view, it is just fascinating and astonishingly beautiful. Now, the Crowley deck goes one step further than the Golden Dawn, as Waite and Smith's did. All of the cards are illustrated. In fact, they're painted in a fine art manner, but Crowley and Harris chose to illustrate the minor arcana in a different way. These are still pip cards to a certain extent, but with illustrative elements. So you can see the two of discs, or the two of coins, or the two of pentacles, surrounded by the snake in the infinity figure of 8. The sort of geometric pattern idea is, you know, the arrangement of the suit symbols is kept, but again, they're surrounded by, you know, Lady Freida's amazing projective geometry, and the suit symbols, the patterns that they form, have magical significance, as you can see. Beautifully illustrated, but in a very different way. They have keywords on the cards to aid you in readings as well. So there we have it. That's the two really significant and influential decks of the early 20th century. The Thoth Tarot was created during the war years, incidentally. Moving up to modern day, this table actually speaks of the legacy of Pamela Colman-Smith's work. All of these very modern decks that I have here, the bulk of them are based on her pattern. Let's just jump back to the 60s and early 70s. I was going to re-mention this deck, the 1JJ. In, I think it was 1971, US Games acquired the exclusive rights to print and market the Smith-Waite deck. They'd also been marketing this reproduction of the 1JJ. And certainly when I was growing up, when I discovered tarot at the age of 13, this and the Waite-Smith were absolutely everywhere. You know, if you sought out tarot in the shops, you would primarily find either this deck, which is a Marseille variant, or the Waite-Smith. And then there were two other decks. You would usually find a modern reproduction of the Marseille, published by Grimaud, which you'll see in later lessons. And this, the deck I discovered tarot through. The Fergus Hall Tarot, featured in the James Bond film Live and Let Die. Again, the inclusion of this deck in the film did a lot to revive interest in tarot. It's still in print today. It's remained continuously in print since 1972, and long may it continue to do so. I have a great fondness for this deck. But yeah, let's have a look at the impact of the Waite-Smith deck. As tarot sales began to expand, obviously the thirst for new decks by modern designers began to get greater. So let's have a look at this from the early 70s. Again, this is still in print. This is a deck called the Morgan Greer Tarot. It draws very heavily on Pamela Colman-Smith's symbolism, but the figures are shown in close-up. And you can see with this, this is painted in the style of the day. Deep, rich colours, a real early 70s style of illustration. And funnily enough, it's a deck that's lasted, it's stood the test of time. Again, it's still in print. It's regarded as a classic. Let's have a look at some of the others. Here's an interesting one. Not so modern, from the 1930s. This was probably the first deck that shows the direct influence of the Waite-Smith. This was, you couldn't buy this in the shops. You had to apply for it from several women's magazines. I think you sent off, you cut out the tokens and you sent off for it. It's called the Thompson-Leng Tarot. But again, it came with a little instruction booklet with fortune-telling meanings, and you can see the influence of Pamela Colman-Smith, and again, the fully illustrated minor arcana. So, yeah. going into the 80s and 90s, when the tarot interest really exploded, that's when you begin to see a huge diversity of styles and types of deck. Here's one from the early 2000s. This is one of my favourite artists. This is Ciro Marchetti's Tarot of Dreams. Very surreal. Ciro Marchetti is an incredibly accomplished digital fantasy artist. Again, it follows the Waite-Smith pattern, but what you can see is that Pamela Colman-Smith's legacy is still here, but it can translate into so many different artistic styles. So you can see here, this is very, very similar in symbolism to the Waite-Smith Five of Pentacles stroke Five of Coins. But the joy of what Pamela Colman-Smith created is that you can take that template, any artist can take that template, and it will, you know, they can adapt it in their own way, which is what's happened. You also see, this is another classic, the Robin Wood Tarot. Now, what begins to happen in the 80s and 90s is that tarot begins to become much more universal. Robin Wood came from a pagan background. Now, what she's created is very much in the Waite-Smith pattern. So, for instance, if we look at the Two of Pentacles, it has its differences, but again, it uses Pamela Colman-Smith as the basis. But what she's done is she's created a deck that will resonate with somebody with a pagan spirituality. So the Judgment card, for instance, rather than showing the Christian symbolism of the Last Judgment, it shows a fiery rebirth, a woman coming out of the cauldron and the phoenix being reborn. So again, this shows you just how universal the tarot is. The message is the same, but the symbolism and the tradition that symbolism that comes from is different. So that's the Robin Wood. What else have we got on the table? Here's another classic, and this was a big seller, the Mythic Tarot. Juliet Sharman Burke and Liz Green, I think. This was a very innovative deck, and it set a pattern. The basic divinatory meanings follow the Waite-Smith, but those meanings are expressed with illustrations from Greek myth. So each of the majors is connected to a Greek deity or a figure from Greek myth. So you can see that the Sun card shows Apollo. The suits each follow the story of one of the Greek myths. So the meanings of the cards from the suit of wands are expressed through the tale of Jason and the Golden Fleece. The myth of Cupid and Psyche is followed through on the cards, the minor arcana for the suit of cups. So you can see there on the Ten of Cups, Cupid and Psyche. This was a massive seller and did a lot to further popularise the tarot. This is even referenced in a Star Trek novel, believe it or not. Enterprise, The Lost Years by J.M. Dillard. And there is a fabulous scene where Leonard McCoy's current girlfriend actually reads Mr. Spock's tarot with an antique, genuine antique 20th century mythic tarot. Beautiful little touch. What else have we got? How about a multicultural take on the tarot? This is from the 1990s. This is Herman Heindel's tarot. Each of the suits represents a different culture. So the court cards from this deck, in the case of the suit of stones, which is equivalent to the suit of pentacles or coins, you can see here the equivalent of the page of stones is White Buffalo Woman. Each of these figures is drawn from a different spiritual tradition to reflect the basic meaning of the card. So you can see now that tarot is, in a lot of these decks, is leaving behind its European roots and embracing something much wider. It's the bewildering range of artistic styles that, have developed. Anything from this wonderfully anarchic illustrative style, this deck from Monica Cleosaki. Quirky, wonderful, fabulous to read with. Right down to almost fine art painting. This is a deck by Giuliano Costa called the Mystical Tarot, I think. And you can see these are astonishing paintings. But again, always following, for the most part, a lot of these decks following Pamela Colman-Smith's pattern. There's the Three of Swords, similar to the Waite Smith. And of course, I also contributed myself to that tradition because I can proudly pick up this deck, which is mine. And this is the Healing Light Tarot, which I created in 2015. And again, there is Pamela Colman-Smith's influence can be felt here. You can see the family on the Ten of Pentacles, and the arrangement of the Pentacles follows Pamela Colman-Smith's use of the Tree of Life. So there you have it. Forgive me for rambling on, but hopefully what I've shown you is that there is no single definitive tarot deck. We're going to be using this one because this is the most influential and it's set the pattern. It's also the easiest to learn with. My own belief is that if you learn with this deck or something similar, you can eventually move on to work with any other deck. I don't even think I've covered all the decks that are on the table here, but I think actually what I've said covers enough. I hope this has helped. This may seem a bit of a rambling lesson, and it also, but the reason I wanted to do this is to show you how these cards have evolved. And actually a lot of the decks that are on the table here are the ones that we'll be meeting through the course. So do bear with me. And in the next lesson, we will be beginning our trip through the minor arcana. And the next lesson will be a basic introduction to those 56 cards. Thanks for bearing with me, and I hope to see you.